Hey, Dottie.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
I'm good. I'm just sending Jason the info. It didn't come through for him. I'm going to mute this for a second and I'll be back.
I show him live on the screen.
Awesome. I don't see him. Hey, there's Jason. Can you hear me, Jason? How about now, Jason? Can you hear me? Let's see here. Oh, sure.
Hi, this is Jason. I'm on here.
Can you hear me all right, Jason?
I have you fine, thanks.
Got a big delay with you. Are you on a mute?
I'm on I dialed in via phone to make it a little bit better. Is that working?
Yep, that works perfect right there. I can hear you fine. Yeah. All right, I think we're good. So I'm gonna mute on this end for a minute and shut up the doors where I'm at. We'll probably start I usually start about 2 minutes after because everybody kind of starts logging in right at 2 o'clock. Let everybody get logged in before we get introductions underway. Just a quick note for everybody joining us today. We are going to get started here in probably about 2 minutes. We have a really large group today and everybody's logging in at the same time. So I'm going to give everybody a chance to get logged in and we'll try to start about 2 minutes after. All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar today. Couple real quick housekeeping items. We have everybody muted, just cuts down on a lot of background noise. And so if you have a question, you can actually post that in the question or chat area. And when we wrap up, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. There's a lot of information to cover in a very short period of time. So if we don't get to all the questions, I'll make sure that we take those questions and answer them and get those back to you. We are recording this, so if you have any colleagues that want to view it, we'll probably make this available within the next 3 or 4 days. We do have 2 more sessions next Monday, which is the 12th, and the following Monday, which is the 19th, that you could also have colleagues if they want to participate. We have roughly about 120 schools and organizations across the United States that are joining us today, so really large turnout for this first in the series, talking about the K-12 active shooter and security issues related to schools. Another question that came up, no, we cannot see you. I know you can see the 3 presenters here using the video. We had a couple people ask. We can't hear you nor see you, so you don't have to put anything over your video to hide your face to all the participants. So by way of introduction, I'm Mike McCarty. I'm the president and CEO of Safe Hiring Solutions and Safe Visitor Solutions. Spent about 8 years in law enforcement with the city of Nashville, Tennessee. Was a violent crime detective, helped them start what at that time was one of the first preventative domestic violence programs in the United States. Left there a little over 20 years ago now, and was doing a lot of training and consulting for Homeland Security, or what became Homeland Security, Justice Department, Department of Defense, really taking a preventative community-based model throughout the US and Europe, which then evolved into starting Safe Hiring Solutions, which is a background screening firm. We work with 6,000 clients, a lot of K-12 schools across the United States, and then Safe Visitor is our integrated visitor management system. We've got two great panelists also with us today. I want to introduce Dottie. I've known Dottie for a long time. We both have done a lot of work in the domestic violence movement. Dottie is currently the Director of Security for the Fort Wayne Community Schools in Fort Wayne, Indiana. They have approximately 30,000 students, 4,500 employees, 63 buildings, so a really large school district. Prior to that, Dottie spent 31 years with the Fort Wayne City Police Department, where she retired at the rank of Deputy Chief. She was also their Director of Training, has a lot of training and experience around hostage negotiations, mental illness, supervision, family violence. She was also a graduate of the 2003 FBI National Academy, and travels all over the world, literally doing family violence, interpersonal skills, prevention training. We're also very fortunate to have Jason Russell today. Jason and I met probably 3 or 4 months ago through a colleague at the Secret Service, where Jason has retired from. So Jason is, at the time we met, he was the president and chief executive officer of Secure Education Consultants, which was recently acquired by Firestorm. And so Jason spent a career with the United States Secret Service as a special agent. He's worked on presidential, vice presidential, and former president security details. So he's going to bring a wealth of understanding and creating those personal security perimeters and how we create those environments where we try to keep these things out of our organization or our school. Prior to the Secret Service, Jason was with the Lansing Police Department in Lansing, Michigan. So got some really, great presentations here. We are limited by time. We are also offering and just kicking off the first summit as a live event here in the Indianapolis area in April. And we'll likely take that to other parts of the country, where we take what we're going to talk about today and build that into a larger one-day event. And the model we're kind of using for those on-site events is a morning where we have kind of quick sessions, 3 or 4 informational sessions. It's going to range from active shooter, perimeter security, and different topics like that. And then the afternoon session is really tabletop discussions. The participants in April are bringing questions as they register to the event, and can still post those questions the morning of the event by basically scanning a QR code. And so then we'll divide those into topics that we'll have facilitators that facilitate discussion. So you bring the problems, we help facilitate the discussion, and hopefully at the end of the day, walk away with some solutions. So don't want to waste any more time talking about, kind of who we are. Let's kind of, get into, really looking at what we're here today and talking about, K-12 active shooter and school security. I kind of said we got 60 minutes. We cannot solve everything that we want to solve in the next 60 minutes. What I'm hoping is we start a really good dialogue and discussion that can really help put your organization or kind of what schools need to do on the right path. Unfortunately, I think we're getting so much chatter and so much information coming at us, right now, that it can be very distracting. We've got, political discussions and gun debates and background checks and all of these different myriad of problems that kind of create the situation that we're trying to solve. And so what we want to do here is really look at, what are some things we might be able to do immediately, maybe at no cost, that can help raise that security level. I can tell you, I've got 5 children. I drop my youngest off every morning. I see things every day right now that aggravate me. And there's simple changes that can be fixed at no cost, but provide a tremendous amount of added security for a school. You know, what kind of policies or what kind of technology can we possibly implement? And what are we missing? What are some other things or discussions that we need to be having? We can't really rely on our government to solve this. You know, policymakers are going to move quickly. I hope what we see is that schools will have access to some funding to be able to do some of the things that you need to do. You know, you've got big debates about whether we should arm or not arm teachers. These are not things we're going to talk about in here. We're not going to talk about, you know, deep discussions on, you know, gun background checks and those types of issues. What we want to focus on, you know, is kind of a couple different areas, and that is really we want to start getting the discussion moved toward a prevention model. Yes, we've got to be prepared to react to any situation, but we need to be spending some time really coming up with policies and protocols to where we're not having to engage an active shooter in our hallway. How do we keep them out? And so we hope to at least start a discussion today that's going to require many more discussions down the road. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to Dottie and just ask, hey, Dottie, you know, more than, you know, 35 years experience in law enforcement, hostage negotiation, leading security for one of the largest school districts in the country. Where do we start?
Well, I really appreciate having some information from the FBI at my fingertips. One being that in all situations with someone who is about to create havoc on one of our buildings, about 85% of the time they leak that information. And so they are telling people about what they are going to do, whether they are posting it to social media, they are texting it to a friend, they are telling a teacher in a writing assignment, they are telling people about what they're going to do. But what has happened in my experience is that a person who is uneducated in making a threat assessment is determining whether or not this child is capable of carrying out what they say they're going to do. So they look at them and say they're a good kid from a good family, they're an athlete, they're an honor student, whatever. And so then they pigeonhole and say, I don't think this kid could. And so therefore they don't carry that information forward. And we need to create an environment in our schools that we are talking about this, that everyone has an obligation to report that information forward, but who do they give it to? And then what does that person do with that information? So what's your threat assessment team look like, and what is their background and experience? And I will tell you that I feel blessed that I have an extremely strong working relationship with the FBI and with our local law enforcement agencies at both county, city, and state level. And if it wasn't for that partnership, I would have to go build that, because they are viable partners in dealing with threat assessments. Since the Parkland school shooting, I have dealt with a weekly, if not almost daily, threat to one of our buildings. And most of it is just social media posting, someone thinking that because they're hiding behind an IP address that we're not going to find them. And I think people are watching what's happening across the country, and we are seeing our students criminally prosecuted for posting these intimidating threats to our buildings. So we have to create that environment, and we have to decide who's going to handle that information and then carry it forward so that people feel like their school is a safe place to send their children and also to work in. So there's definitely been a contagion effect there. And one of the ways that we are addressing it is kids don't talk on the telephone anymore. They don't pick up a phone, but they certainly text. Would you all agree? And so having a text line created 24 hours a day that someone can anonymously text in information that they have heard, whether it's on Snapchat or Facebook or whatever other yik yak, whatever tool they are using, that we'll be able to follow up on that information and decide what our plan is for the next day of school. Seconds matter. And so that information, we can't, even if it's on a weekend, we can't wait till Monday to start figuring out what we're going to do. That seconds matter, that we start investigating that immediately, but it also means that we have got to start treating our front office staff as a very valuable part of our emergency plan, because they're our first line of defense. It's kind of like, as a police officer, your dispatchers, you count on them to gather the right information to give to the officers who are responding to the scene, so that they are safe and the people that they are going to help can remain safe as well. So we have got to give our front office staff the tools to be able to screen visitors at the door. And when I came to the school corporation, I will tell you, folks would just say, well, we just release the door, we let them in, and we figure out what they want. And I think all three of us on this panel can sit here and tell you, oops, too late. It is too late to figure out what they want when they come in that door and they're angry and they're yelling and screaming and they're making demands and they happen to be armed. So we have got to give them the tools to see that person outside as they are approaching, watching their body language, screening them with certain questions, then allowing them entry, but then still giving them another avenue, which is a secure vestibule. So you may pop that front door to allow them entry into the school, but they can't get past that secure vestibule into the office and into the rest of the school without permission granted from another release of a door. And we've even went a step further, and that is to put on magnetic locks on those doors. So if that secretary or person who's screening that visitor changes their mind, they can hit another button that will then magnetically lock those doors and prevent that person from coming further into the school. So it's same concept as many banks have gone to, where they lock a person into an area. They can exit out of the building, but they cannot get any further into the building. So I mentioned just briefly an emergency plan, and I encourage folks to consider one emergency plan template for every building in their district. I don't know about your school district, but our employees are extremely nomadic. They move from one building and transfer to another job assignment at another building, and then they're pulling out a 3-ring binder and looking at a plan that someone wrote who probably doesn't have a whole lot of background in threat assessment either, put together an emergency plan for that building. I encourage you to create a template that is used for all buildings, so that when you have substitute staff members or when you have someone who transfers from one building to another, they know what the plan is. Yeah, the floor plan is different, but they know what the procedure is should there be a lockout, a lockdown, or evacuation necessary. Our state law prohibits us, or protects us, I should say, from having to release what our emergency plan contains. And after the Parkland school shooting, I can't tell you the number of phone calls and emails I fielded from media personnel, as well as parents, as well as board members who wanted to see our emergency plan. Folks, why would we give that to people? Why would we tell them what our plan is? Our law says that is one thing that is exempted from us releasing that information. Yes, we want to assure them we have a plan, but we do not need to release all the ins and outs of what that looks like. In that plan also, I would tell you to please consider using plain language. Years ago, law enforcement went to plain language. They dropped codes and signals so that people could communicate with each other. In a crisis situation, we know that certain skills go out the window. And so telling them that Dr. So-and-so is in the building and that's supposed to mean that there's a threat, it doesn't mean anything. So use plain language. The shooter or the intruder knows what they look like. They know what they're wearing. They know where they are. So why wouldn't we share that information with everyone else in the building so that they can make a decision for themselves based on where they're located, on what their avenue is going to be to get out safely and survive the incident. The other thing is when you walk into buildings and when I look at floor plans, I see a lot of hallways that have been given nicknames. It's the 6th grade wing. I have one that's actually says the Squaw Avenue. Whatever they name that, we need to consider making it north, south, east, and west. Because when our first responders come to our school, they are going to come into the building and not understand where that 6th grade wing is. Unless there's big signage that calls that out, that means nothing to them. So if you can consider using directions of north, south, east, and west and educating your staff on that, that will be very helpful for our first responders coming in. Presence of staff at arrival and dismissal. I have come to truly appreciate the hours that our staff members put in to educate our students. It isn't a Monday through Friday job. It certainly isn't a 7 to 4 job. They are constantly on preparing and working to figure out ways to educate all students. But we have got to expound on and really identify for them the importance of their presence at arrival and dismissal. There's some data out there that suggests over 40% of our school threats arrive at the time when all the students are coming in or students are leaving. There's so much hustle and bustle. It is very, very easy for someone who is a non-student or someone who is banned from the building, who is suspended, who is under investigation, a former employee, someone who has a grudge, a husband or wife of an employee who has a protective order against them, someone who could potentially be a threat to our building to come in during that time frame. As I said, it's estimated 40% of our threats will arrive at arrival or dismissal. So it's not just having staff members present at the doors during those time periods, but they need to be actively engaging people. They need to be looking for those things that don't fit. You may or may not have just seen the recent incident where a middle school student in Ohio was able to bring a rifle on a school bus, come to the school, and then complete an act of suicide in the bathroom at the school once he got there. It makes you question as to who was where and watching and observing and what information was shared or not. How did that student get by all those adults and enter the school with a rifle and complete that act? Those are things that when you do after action reviews, we go back and consider where were our weaknesses and where can we improve upon that. So staff members know who the students are that are suspended or expelled. They should know the adults who don't belong. A very strong part of your security management for your school should be that all adults in the building either have an employee ID that is visible or they have a visitor badge that they are wearing. If another adult sees an adult without one of those 2 pieces of credentials, someone should be stopping them and asking them how they can get them back to the office and get them properly checked in. Because that should be one of those, this doesn't fit, this is not right in your buildings. Keys for substitutes to lock classroom doors. Because we have so many subs in and out of our buildings, we have to consider, do they have the ability to secure their classroom if they are unable to evacuate? And that should be something that they could check in or check out each day. Or maybe there's a different system that you may have with a keyless entry system. But we need to consider, how do we assist those people who are coming to visit for a day to provide a service in our building? And then the last thing that I'd like to talk about before I turn it over to Mike and Jason again is to talk about what your plan is. We know from looking at Columbine, Sandy Hook, Virginia Tech, so many other incidents across the country, Bailey, Colorado, that time is of the essence and that we have got to do more than just shelter in place. Majority of the shootings, if we can evacuate and gain distance from the situation, we have exponentially increased our survivability rate. Gaining distance and learning to evacuate is extremely important for our staff members and our students to understand. And when I go and do the civilian response to active shooter presentation in our buildings, I'll walk into a room and I'll just quickly ask the staff members, how many exit points do we have right now? And most of them will look around and count the door and say 1 or 2. And I'll say, I see 7 or I see 5. And then I just let them ponder that. And then they'll say things like, yeah, but those windows don't open, or those windows open, but they open in. And we have to change people's mindset. We have to talk about it now. No one's opening those windows. And so the next question always is, well, how am I breaking them? And I think all three of us would agree we don't care. With whatever tools you have available to you, whether that's your foot, a chair, a brick, whatever you have available to you in that classroom. But if you don't talk about these things beforehand, asking people to think that way when the crisis is unfolding in front of them is extremely foreign, and they will not be able to run, they will not be able to fight, but they certainly will freeze. And so our plan is avoid, deny, defend. And we don't have time today to talk about what each of those things are, but you notice that it's not hide. Avoid, deny, defend. And not only do we talk about that with our staff members, but we talk about that with our students. And we have it broken down by grade levels, what that message looks like. For the younger ones, it is truly a coloring book, and it does talk about defending the castle. And we've made some great metaphors with a kingdom and a castle. And it's just something that we had to create rather than the language that we would use for a middle school or high school, was create a language for the elementary students as well, so they are prepared too, should this scenario unfold. Mike?
Awesome, Dottie. Thank you. I do have one question I want to follow up. You mentioned this very early on. You were talking about, evaluating those threats, which can be daunting, to say the least, putting together. And so I was curious, one, I testified in the legislative body recently, and one of the things we were talking about is being able to anonymously provide information. And we were talking more about sexual abuse within the school, or solicitation from an adult to a student. And there was a real reluctance that could be manipulated, an anonymous text line or something could be manipulated. How do you handle that at Fort Wayne? Is there a team, or are you the one that evaluates all this information? How does that work?
So certainly the information comes to me initially as the director of security, but we employ about 140 off-duty officers, and that includes our school resource officers, who we moved from our high schools to our middle schools several years back because we realized that we wanted them building relationships with kids much before they got to high school. We wanted them building relationship with students at elementary and middle school. And they have done such a phenomenal job that kids do come forward and tell them information. And then the school resource officer works with me and the police departments to then conduct that threat assessment. Today, I've been working with the FBI on a threat that came in via a voice over IP. So yeah, it was anonymous because the person can hide behind that, but we do know that our partners in law enforcement can trace that back to, who's the service provider and who owns that IP address, and then a knock on the door from those federal or state agencies that can assist us with that. So we work very, very closely with our local law enforcement when we look at the threat here, the information that we have, what information we have on that student's past behavior, who are their associates, what access do they have to firearms. We have no problem with calling up parents and say, we've received this threat, this is what we need, don't bring your kid to school tomorrow, they're suspended pending investigation. But we employ a lot of people to be able to partner with us to make an educated guess on whether or not this person will follow through.
Okay, excellent. Was a perfect segue, Jason. When you think of threat assessment, you think Secret Service. I mean, that's really what they're in business doing. And so, you know, as a former special agent, assigned to, protect presidents, vice presidents, former presidents, what can you tell us about the amount of effort or the importance of that advanced work that you used to do with the Secret Service? How does that equate to what schools should be doing?
Well, I'll start with kind of piggybacking on what Dottie said about that behavioral threat assessment, which is really the piece that I think schools are missing right now. I mean, I think what I keep seeing, we know that these shooters walk a path. We've seen it over and over again, and the warning signs are consistent amongst shooters. They're consistent across the issues. But what we haven't seen is a really consistent approach on how to, identify those behaviors of concern before somebody actually makes it to an attack and then intervene. So to piggyback on what Dottie said, and where a lot of that comes from the Secret Service, is that identifying threats before they get to the violence. So that threat assessment piece is really the one that every school should be focusing on, that laser focused right now, because it is especially with, the middle and high school attackers, it's the most effective form of prevention. But we know they walk a path, we know it, and we've seen it. And what we keep doing after a shooting is, instead of going back to the beginning of the path, we keep trying to fix things at the end of the path by putting more physical security in place, and by talking about, hey, maybe if we put guns in the classrooms, that'll help, instead of saying, you know what, why don't we try to work farther back in the path and try to prevent these things before it gets to an attack. So I think I wanted to start off by talking about that threat assessment. And if any of the schools that are on here now, if you don't have a behavioral threat assessment program in place, it's an absolute must. It's not a luxury. It's something that has to exist. And if you don't have one, please email me when we get off this call, and I'll help you with that. As far as the rest of the prevention, Mike, I think that one of the things that everybody should remember is preparation and prevention happens in layers. And I think too often what schools do is they focus only on kind of the physical security layer. So we put cameras up and we put barriers in place, but we don't really focus on the other layers of prevention that are necessary, which are good policy, good procedure, and then finally training. And, one of the things that Dottie said that I try not to jump up and down when she was saying it, but it was right on, is think about these vestibules that we're putting in schools all over the country. And we're never training those people at the front desk. As far as the person at the front desk is concerned, the only thing between the day before the vestibule was installed and the day after was now they have to push a button. But they've never been given any training on, when do I not let somebody in? What are the questions I should ask? How should I ask the questions? So that prevention piece, it really does happen in layers. And we talk about really starting with every school, starting with assessing their facilities. And when I say assessing, I don't mean take a check sheet and go down it and say, did we, are the hedges trimmed, and, kind of a basic one. I'm talking get really granular and look at your sites and look for weaknesses, because what you have in a physical security feature might not work based on your operations. So we see many times with this, even the secure vestibules, we'll see people hold the door open for other parents, or we'll see an office staff person who just doesn't know and just buzzes everybody. And I call it the 98.6 rule. If there's a human being at the door, they buzz them in, and what it becomes then is just a super, really expensive doorbell, quite frankly. So assessing your facility to make sure that, okay, what are our weaknesses? Look in your environment. One of the things that a lot of places, and we do a lot of work beyond schools, and especially after Las Vegas, it's come into play, that look around you. Don't just look at your own physical location. Look at what's around me. What's around our facilities? What's in our area that could be a danger to us? And then slowly shrink that perimeter back in and really assess each area. What's our outer perimeter look like? How are our gates? How are our fences? How are, what barriers do we have? Look at your exterior. Look at, all the features that go along with securing those. And then also look at how the policy and procedures work. Everything from, how do we park cars? There's so many fine details that go into safety and security. And starting with a really kind of granular site assessment is kind of a key feature to see kind of where your weaknesses are, because that allows you to determine what you need to fix. And one of the things we find with site assessments is many schools are afraid to ask themselves the question. They don't want to know the answer, so they don't ask the question. And I haven't been to a school yet where we haven't had 5, 6, 10 pages of findings in a site assessment. And these are schools that are trying. And there's just a lot that goes into safety and security. So I think starting off with that, really kind of taking a very critical look at what you have in place, and not just what you're supposed to have in place, but how it actually works. And that's the difference. Do you have one of the questions that I always use as an example is, do you have a visitor management system? And a lot of places on a site assessment will check that as a yes or no. Well, there should be about 25 questions that come underneath that. How does it work? Who controls it? You're using visitor tags. Where are they housed at? So a granular site assessment is important. That's one of the things that I think, coming from the Secret Service background, is really looking at it almost in the eyes of somebody who would want to try to penetrate your security or launch some type of an attack, whether it be violent or just simply a property attack, property damage. The next thing is, and Dottie pointed this out too, look at your procedures, your emergency plan, and make sure that they make sense. That sounds really basic, but unfortunately, I've read far too many emergency plans that were written by people that have never responded to an emergency. It would be as if I was to write a cookbook. I can't cook, so I don't write cookbooks. But yet we allow people to write emergency plans that have limited or no experience at actually dealing with, responding, and understanding how emergencies actually work. And one of the things that's really common is we love these big, enormous emergency plans, hundreds of pages with graphics. And what you find is nobody looks at it. It's so big and it's so daunting that people look at that big 3-ring binder and they think, I'm never going to be able to understand everything in this. So what you need to focus on, and Dottie pointed it out once again, is primary protocols. Your shelter in place, your lockout, your evacuation, because a teacher in a classroom needs to know the basics. They're not going to remember the protocols for 25 different emergencies. They're going to remember maybe 2 or 3 things at the most. So you want those 2 or 3 things to be really beneficial. So having protocols in place, and really your site assessment needs to play a role in your emergency plan. In other words, I've seen so many emergency plans that the plan says to do things that are not even physically possible given the environment that the school is in. I was at a school recently where the teachers were told that they should barricade their doors. The problem was every door in the school opened out into the hallway. So I remember saying, well, how are you going to do this? And their answer was, well, we don't know. First of all, they had never read the plan, luckily, but the plan just didn't match the site. So you also have to think of your plans in terms of the age range that's going to be responding and making sure that it makes sense for that particular age range. So that those emergency protocols are key. But what ties everything together, and the thing that unfortunately schools are not focusing enough on, is training. There's an old Navy SEAL saying that says, in emergencies, people don't rise to the occasion, they sink to the level of their training. And yet training is the thing we're least likely to do. And when in reality, it's probably the only necessary thing, because it's the thing that's going to actually make sense in the moment. And one of the things that when I work with schools and I talk about training, they say, well, we're going to send 2 of our teachers. And I say, well, what about the rest of them? And they say, well, we can't send them all. So I guess they just send their 2 favorites, and hopefully they can tell everybody else what to do. Training is really it's the linchpin, and it really is the biggest key to this whole process, is making sure that people understand what to do and really understand it in a way that is educator friendly. One of the problems I have with some of the trainings is that they're law enforcement training that's trying to be crammed into a school environment. And as everybody on the call knows, because you're educators they're not police officers. We shouldn't be training them like police officers. We have to train them in a way that makes sense to them and in a manner that is beneficial to them. So having those three pieces, which is the site assessment, the emergency planning, and then the critical incident training, the training on how to actually respond, is critical. And then that threat assessment piece, and I created a program along with the University of Alabama, specifically using all the different threat assessment tools that existed and kind of package them up for schools to be able to not only train to understand what the warning signs are, but also to have a mechanism in place to actually do these screenings, to do this process, to make sure that they're actually understanding what they're looking for. And that anonymous reporting capability that Dottie mentioned is crucial. It's not even, it's absolutely necessary, because we know that kids are not going to report. We've seen it. If you look at 50 to 60% of the attacks that happen in schools have been preceded by a direct threat. That's a gimme. But we're still missing those things, and we're not necessarily, and to Dottie's point, we're not necessarily even taking it seriously. And a lot of times that's because the people at the school haven't been trained enough in the issues to really kind of, understand where to take it. What do we do with this information? And unfortunately, sometimes the intervention strategies that are applied, I think, push the potential attacker farther down the path as opposed to pulling them back. And really, that's our goal, is to prevent these things from happening by applying security across layers. Our physical security, good policy and procedure, solid training, behavioral threat assessment across the board, everything that we can possibly do to make sure that we're trying to prevent these things before they actually end up in an attack.
That's good stuff, Jason. When you talk about training, I know many states, or probably all states maybe, are mandated to do, fire training and different drills. How frequently, and Dottie, you can chime in here as well, how frequently do you see schools, Jason, when you go out and do an assessment, that are actually doing any type of, training, like a large scale training, how to evacuate, what to do in a crisis? Are you seeing much of that happening?
What I see normally is they'll do exactly what the state tells them to do. But unfortunately, and the evacuation and the fire, we've known those have been around for years, and schools do a pretty good job. And, if I said stop, drop, and every person on the other end of this call just said roll. So we know that because we've been trained in it, and we can do the evacuations. But when it comes to some of the newer and the more violent things, unfortunately, many times, even if they are practicing, do we even know if they're practicing correctly? Because how have they been trained to even know how to do it? Many schools don't have somebody like Dottie in place that is an expert on these things that can help them. They're kind of flying by the seat of their pants, and many times even their local law enforcement isn't really equipped or necessarily have the resources to help them with those. So the large-scale exercises are fairly rare, because the schools just don't have the time, and a lot of times there's kind of an interesting issue that they have with that, where they don't want to skip, the parents sometimes have a reaction to those, a negative reaction to those. They never have a negative reaction to the fire drills, but when it comes to some of these more, because it puts that thought in their head of this, kind of interpersonal violence situation, and they don't want to think about it. So the schools really just do what's required, and even then, many times they're not doing it correctly, unfortunately.
Yeah, if I could maybe just jump in and say that I feel for many schools, because we have a couple of buildings that are 2,000 students or above. And so evacuating 2,000 students out of a building is a little bit more than disruptive. It is a major deal to get them back in and to get them settled down, to try to educate them again. And state law requires that we perform 2 a year, 1 per semester, But exactly what Jason said, what's that look like? Who knows from building to building what that actually looks like. And we have had some law enforcement agencies across the country volunteer to do an active shooter scenario in the buildings, and we've seen people hurt, and we've seen some, pretty much a free-for-all, and that is not training. Their training has a purpose to it, has an objective, and the objective is that everybody learns and is safe and is able to utilize the material afterwards. So having people do tabletop exercises, I think, is a wise choice if you're going to go to the next layer, rather than throw I used to say throw a video at them and have them look at it and say, yeah, they were trained. That's not training either. It has to be where they have to think and they have to process information in a quick fashion, what they're going to do. I remember when I started doing the civilian response to active shooter and just threw the question out, do you think it's a wise idea to pull the fire alarm should you hear shots in your building? And now that Parkland's happened and that scenario came to play again, people were like, well, no, because it drowns out the noise, and people run out into the hallways because we've been doing fire drills since the 1950s. And when's the last time we had a fatal fire in our schools? The 1950s. But how many active shooter scenarios have we had since? So we really have got to start putting real training into the schools that can be utilized, that is palatable. And I will tell you, that was really hard for me, coming from a law enforcement background and talking to educators about something as serious as an active shooter. The language that I used, I scared people. And so I really had to start changing. Quit laughing, Mike, but I had to start changing some of the words that I used because I wanted them to get the message, but I had to make it so that they could wrap their head around it and realize that they could be surviving.
Excellent. I've got one question here. Let me see if I can get this opened up. How do schools handle situations when threats are sent through an anonymous program or app such as Sarah? Not familiar with.
Yep.
Okay, Dottie gets, all right. This program was created in another country and it's difficult to track these type of messages.
Right, so we just had that very same app used with a threat, and they just used the initials SHS, that there would be, it said shoots fired instead of shots fired at SHS, beware, don't come to school. And so every school across the United States that had SHS, ours was a local high school, but we also had a school in Ohio, we had a school in Wisconsin, and we were working with all these law enforcement agencies to figure out where this threat originated and what was the validity of it, and did we need to put any plan in place. And that, again, we employed all of our law enforcement resources. I'm from a city that's large enough that we have officers that are cross-deputized with U.S. Marshals, DEA, and FBI. So, yeah, I use those resources. But if you don't have them, you need to develop them. If it's not your county, it's the county next to it, or it's within the region. But those are the resources that you need to use to be able to follow that back to where it originated as best as you can. And then if you cannot, with 100% certainty, and Jason can tell you this, that you cannot identify whether or not it's real or not, you need to put a measure of security in place for a time period until that threat minimizes or dissipates.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we have to take into account, because it's happening, obviously, and Dottie knows she's dealing with it every day, and a lot of my client schools are, is you have to take context into count with these threats, because it's going to happen. You need to take them all seriously. You need to investigate. You need to reach out to your local law enforcement, but you also need to take content and one of the context into play. And one of the things that Dottie pointed out was just things like misspelling and things like the way language is used. We had a school who got a bomb threat that said there was bombs in all 10 schools and they were going to all go off at the exact same time. I mean, what is the likelihood of somebody being able to plant 10? Now, do we need to sweep the schools, and do we need to, take preventative steps to make sure that we're covering all our bases? Yes. But do we need to close the school necessarily, and do we need to evacuate everybody out and take all these kind of extreme measures? Maybe not necessarily, and a lot of that is based on the context of the threat. Now, if you have a written threat, that's found in the locker room on a wall, that's different, because it's not coming in over some random voice over IP or an internet thing, and it has more specific information, and that's kind of the context that comes into play. What is it saying it's going to do? How specific is the information that's provided?
Okay, thanks. Got another question here. With logistics of buildings built in the 70s, it is problematic for single point of entry for our high schools. Any suggestions?
If you can't have a single point of entry, you have to figure out a way to vet people before they get in the school in the best way you can. So, in the absence of being able to funnel people in that one point of entry or directly into the office, you at least want to limit your entries. And if you can have people just all come to one door, that's the best case scenario. We still use cameras being used in entries. If you can't have a visual inspection of the person, then the camera is kind of the second best. But you have to make sure you have audio capability so that the person can speak to the person on the other end. And look, there was a lot of schools built in the 50s and 60s, and they're all dealing with these issues. How do we secure the schools without a major renovation? And sometimes it just takes a little bit of creativity. But the bottom line is you have to control the entry. You just have to, especially in an elementary school. You need to realize where your threats most likely originate. And that's why elementary schools having that secure entry are so critical, because that your most likely threat is an external threat coming from the outside. Whereas in a high school, your most likely threat is internal. It's probably somebody inside, a student. So understanding that your security needs to match up with your threat is critical.
We have in all of our buildings one point of entry when it comes to visitors. They are only permitted to come in door one, and our mantra has started to be security is not convenient. And people get really upset about having to walk all the way around the building when the parking lot's over here, but I got to walk here. And we're like, we appreciate, the inconvenience that it has caused you. However, this makes our schools a lot safer. And when you tell parents that it's a little hard for them to argue with you, that what you're doing, protecting their child who is enrolled there at that school, isn't more important than them having to walk a few extra feet around the school. And if you have points of entry that are open only at arrival and dismissal, which almost all buildings do that I've been associated with, they have to be staffed. They cannot just have the doors thrown open and you let the kids run out the door and nobody watches them coming back in with their parent or somebody else coming in. You have to have those doors staffed.
Excellent. Thank you. I like that mantra. So, got a couple minutes here. We're kind of wrapping things up. A lot of what you heard here, just really looking at, and some of these are sticking points for me because I see them more as a parent each day than actually as a consultant for K-12, dropping, elementary daughter off and, nobody else standing outside that doorway and the kids are walking in by themselves. So, just looking at those entry points, Jason talked about visitor management system, managing those visitors, volunteers, vendors, who's coming into the building, why are they coming into the building, have they been vetted appropriately to be allowed into a building, are you able to flag people that are not supposed to be in your building? Most schools that we work with have lists that can be in the 10s, 20s, up into the hundreds of individuals that are not allowed on that school property that have posed a threat or a risk to the school. How are you flagging them? We can get into bigger discussions about, the use of technology in conjunction with the policies and procedures and the training, and the facial recognition and some of the things that's coming out today that are really some great pieces of technology. And one of the things, I'm a technologist. I mean, that's what we do now. I come out of law enforcement, but there's a lot of stuff out there that's James Bondsy, and it looks great, but it's going to provide nothing in terms of security for your school. And so really looking at things that, why would I want this, and what would it do for me? When we talk about facial recognition, you think, well, that's cool because I've seen it in the movies. Well, there's some cool pieces of that technology we've been evaluating for a while. It can allow me to place people that have been well vetted, so it recognizes them as they're coming up to, before they even come into a vestibule. Up to 50 feet, some of the cameras we're looking at can actually recognize, and you can have those integrated within an access control for employees or folks that allowed into a building. But it also works backwards. It also can identify folks that are not allowed on that property and trying to push that perimeter out. So now maybe I identify them 30 or 40 feet from the door as opposed to even in the vestibule. And so, really taking a look at some of the technology. We talked about, a lot with being able to have an anonymous, reporting of threats and how we handle that. So I think we had a really good discussion there. I would say involve some of your students. And I know it sounds a little itchy when you say, well, how do I involve a student? Parents are fearful. We're talking about subjects I don't really want to talk about. We got to talk about it. And I tell you what, we found we've got a lot of interns that are college level interns. We learn so much from these interns. Is involving these youth advisors as part of some type of security team. I mean, how you communicate with the students, how are they most likely to respond and provide information. One of the things we're doing is we've got a big meeting coming up on March 16th. We're bringing together law enforcement, school security, private security for a big discussion. And a lot of this discussion is really centering around some of the technology pieces that can be used and how are those used. The next kind of phase is we're going to really, our approach here is we always work closely with schools. Dottie can attest to this. I've known her forever. And as we built Safe Visitor, Dottie was at the table the whole time. We built this to work for schools. I don't want to guess what you need in a school. And so we're going to want a lot of partners from across the country to evaluate some of the things that we're working on to make sure we're on the right track. These are things that will make a difference, that will make your schools more secure. So if that's something that is at all appealing, reach out to me and, we'll make sure that we have you on a list that we can reach out as we start to develop some of these things out a little bit further. Some of the upcoming learning opportunities, I mentioned the security camp here locally. Anybody's welcome to participate. But again, we're going to be looking for, schools in different parts of the country that maybe want to host this, and we'll bring this event to you. We do a Safe Visitor weekly demo. So maybe a visitor management system is not something you're really familiar with. We do this every week. You can jump on, you can listen to it, you can learn about how a visitor management system works, and then begin to evaluate what's going to work in your facility. Probably the number one question I've been asked over the years is, a lot of schools want a self-service kiosk, and Dottie, she's heard me say it a million times, I'm never going to do it. Why? Because if I take and automate that with just a kiosk where I can come in and really enter whatever I want to enter, I've defeated the whole purpose here. Yes, it makes it easier. Yes, it's more friendly. But at the end of the day, I've accomplished nothing in terms of security. And so as you really start to evaluate these products, again, just reach out to us. We'd love to have some schools, join this advisory group as we look at some of these models. Here's my contact information. I can get you in contact with Dottie and Jason as well. So all you got to do is email me. That's my direct line. You can call me. Actually just see another question popped up here, and I think we have about 1 minute, so let me open that. Last question. We are an outside agency housed within a school building, working mostly in after-school hours. Certainly, this presents special issues that may or may not be within our control. Are there resources you can direct us to for this type of scenario, particularly when these hours present different activities and points of entry?
I think I probably need to know more.
Yeah, I was going to kind of say the same thing. I mean, I think what you have to do is, can you include yourself in the school's emergency plan? Is there any coordination between the two entities to say, you know, we're inside your facilities, because you want to do as much coordination with that group as possible. If you're totally operating independently, then you need your own emergency procedures, but you also need to understand the facilities that you're operating in. You need to understand what alert capability do we have. You know, you need to understand the locks, the doors, the glass. You need to understand everything, because you're responsible when you're kind of in charge of these activities. So I think I would first work with the district, and if that doesn't work, you definitely need to look into getting your own plan in place.
Great. Well, it's straight up 3 o'clock. Thank you, Dottie. Thank you, Jason, for jumping on. We appreciate it. Thank you for all the participants. If you think of questions, want more information, you've got our contact, or you've got my contact information, and I can connect you to Jason and Dottie as well. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Thanks.